Prince Andrew is facing increasing pressure to move out of the Royal Lodge at Windsor, with representatives of King Charles reportedly in talks over the disgraced royal's home.
For more than 2 decades, Royal Lodge in Windsor stood as one of the most prestigious addresses in the British royal family. But in October 2025, everything changed. King Charles took the extraordinary step of stripping his younger brother of all his titles and honors, and setting in motion an eviction that has captivated the world. What really happened when Buckingham Palace ordered the surrender of Royal Lodge, triggering the deepest royal family rift in over a century? Join us as we uncover the full story of Andrew's eviction from Royal Lodge, the Royal Lodge years, and the peppercorn rent scandal. Royal Lodge wasn't just any royal residence. The Grade 2 listed Georgian mansion sits within Windsor Great Park and features amenities that most people could only dream of. 30 beautifully appointed rooms, 7 bedrooms, a large drawing room, a sunken garden, its own private chapel, a swimming pool, an aviary, 6 lodge cottages, and accommodations for protection officers. The property held deep sentimental value because it had been the childhood home of Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, and later became the Queen Mother's residence until her death in 2002. When Andrew moved into Royal Lodge in 2003, he was given a favorable 75-year lease agreement scheduled to run until June 15, 2078. The lease required him to pay £1 million up front, but the annual rent was described as peppercorn rent if demanded, meaning a nominal amount so low it was merely symbolic. His ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, moved back in 2008, and the divorced couple lived there together for years. When details of the peppercorn rent arrangement became public in 2024, the outcry was immediate and fierce. At a time when ordinary British citizens were struggling with a cost of living crisis, the revelation that Andrew was essentially living rent-free in a multi-million-pound mansion while embroiled in scandal struck many as deeply offensive. Public pressure mounted for Andrew to be removed from the property. King Charles had been working for years to make the monarchy more efficient and save money, but the situation with the Royal Lodge was becoming difficult. Reports indicated that Charles had been talking to his brother for months, trying to persuade him to move to a smaller place like Frogmore Cottage. However, Andrew would not agree, thinking his lease protected him legally. Things got worse when Virginia Giuffre's memoir came out in 2024, which renewed attention on Andrew's ties to Jeffrey Epstein. The pressure on King Charles to take strong action became too much to handle. But while the public wanted Andrew gone, making him actually leave would prove far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The October 2025 stripping of titles and formal eviction notice. On October 30, 2025, Buckingham Palace released a statement that made headlines worldwide. His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and honors of Prince Andrew, the statement began. Prince Andrew will now be known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The palace addressed the Royal Lodge situation directly. His lease on Royal Lodge has, to date, provided him with legal protection to continue in residence. Formal notice has now been served to surrender the lease, and he will move to alternative private accommodation. The statement added that these censures are deemed necessary, notwithstanding the fact that he continues to deny the allegations against him. Most importantly, the palace said, "The King and Queen want everyone to know that they care deeply about the victims and survivors of all types of mistreatments." This clearly showed that the royal family supported the victims instead of Andrew. Andrew's titles were taken away, which is very unusual in the history of the British royal family. The last time something similar happened was with Prince Charles Edward, who was a grandson of Queen Victoria. He lost his Duke of Albany title in 1917 after he fought for Germany during World War I. King Charles's decision to take away Andrew's titles showed just how serious the situation had become for him. Andrew was given at least 12 months to move out of his residence, which means he had until October 2026 to leave. However, sources close to the situation said that King Charles hoped Andrew would leave much sooner than that, ideally by Easter 2025. Sarah Ferguson, who had lived at Royal Lodge with Andrew and used the courtesy title Duchess of York, also lost her title when Andrew's dukedom was removed. Friends said Sarah was very upset and was turning to her daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, for support. Questions emerged about whether Andrew would be entitled to compensation for the millions he had invested in renovating Royal Lodge over the years. The Crown Estate conducted an assessment to determine the property's condition and calculate any potential compensation. But as details emerged about the state of Royal Lodge, the compensation question would take a shocking turn: the hoarding crisis and archaeological excavation inside Royal Lodge. As removal vans began appearing at Royal Lodge gates in late 2025, disturbing stories emerged about what had been happening inside the mansion for years. Multiple insiders described Andrew as a hoarder, whose accumulation of possessions had turned what should have been a straightforward move into an incredibly complex process. Some rooms were piled to the ceiling with documents and photographs. Friends of Andrew told reporters that the clutter at Royal Lodge is turning what should be a straightforward move into a months-long, room-by-room excavation. One source added that even if Andrew wanted to move tomorrow, he couldn't because of the sheer volume of possessions requiring careful sorting. This revelation helped explain why his departure was taking so much longer than King Charles had hoped. What had been envisioned as a relatively quick transition was now looking more likely to drag on until at least Andrew's 66th birthday on February 19, 2026, if not longer. The hoarding situation also raised questions about Andrew's mental state and how he had been coping with isolation since stepping back from royal duties in 2019. Sources suggested he had increasingly retreated into his collection of documents and photographs as a way of maintaining a connection to his former life. Reports indicated that Andrew was moving to a shoebox-sized house compared to Royal Lodge, meaning most of his accumulated possessions simply wouldn't fit. A storage unit had been arranged for the overflow, but this meant additional decisions about what to keep versus what to discard. The Crown Estate's assessment found that, in all likelihood, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor will not be owed any compensation for early surrender of the lease once dilapidations are taken into account. Despite having paid £1 million up front and investing millions more in renovations, he would likely receive nothing back because the property's condition didn't meet lease standards. But while the problems at Royal Lodge were serious, revelations about Andrew's new home would prove even more shocking. Marsh Farm revealed as Andrew's new residence. Despite serious concerns. When news broke about where Andrew would be moving, royal watchers were surprised. Marsh Farm, located in Wolferton, approximately 2 miles west of Sandringham House, was a small working farm that had been unoccupied for years after the previous tenant farmer died. The property was described as ramshackle and significantly run down, requiring extensive renovations before it could serve as suitable accommodation. The contrast with Royal Lodge could not have been more obvious. While Andrew had been accustomed to 30 rooms across a grand mansion with every amenity, Marsh Farm was essentially a modest farmhouse requiring dramatic downsizing. Sources said he really didn't want Marsh Farm and would have preferred Prince Philip's former home, Wood Farm, which was larger and closer to Sandringham House. However, Wood Farm was deemed inappropriate, for Andrew specifically because it would place him too close to the rest of the royal family during occasions like Christmas. The decision to place Andrew at Marsh Farm, 2 miles away, was seen as deliberate isolation from the family, while still providing accommodation. A royal source said, "One thing for sure is that it is a lot smaller and less luxurious than Royal Lodge." Friends indicated that Andrew won't have lived anywhere that small since he left his apartment at Buckingham Palace, and then he had free roam of the building and grounds. By January 2026, construction crews descended on Marsh Farm to begin extensive work. Reports described at least 6 workmen toiling outside in the rain, installing new security features and making repairs. A new 6-foot fence replaced the original barbed wire, and security companies installed CCTV cameras and surveillance systems throughout. The property lacked suitable garaging for Andrew's cars, which hasn't gone down well with him. It also wasn't large enough for live-in staff, so King Charles planned to provide a cleaner, a groundsman, and a cook from Sandringham to look after Andrew's needs on an ad hoc basis. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams suggested this arrangement was deliberate, noting that keeping Andrew at Sandringham was one way of, in a sense, controlling him. But while these concerns were significant, they paled in comparison to shocking environmental warnings about Marsh Farm's location. The shocking flood risk warnings that threaten Andrew's new home. In January 2026, reports emerged that sent shockwaves through royal circles. Marsh Farm, it turned out, was located on a floodplain and carried significant flood risk according to environmental assessments. This meant Andrew was moving, not just to a smaller property, but potentially to a home that could be inundated with water during severe weather events. A flood risk assessment from 2024 for Wolferton Barns, just meters from Marsh Farm, stated that the Environment Agency operates a flood warning system to enable householders to protect life or act to manage the effect of flooding on property. This was official recognition that flooding represented a real danger. The assessment detailed specific risks. Failure of Wolferton Pumping Station may occur due to long-term mechanical breakdown or power supply being disrupted. If this critical system failed, properties like Marsh Farm would be directly threatened. The document concluded that if conditions put properties and land at risk of flooding, emergency action would be taken using temporary pumping equipment. Marsh Farm's safety from flooding relied on a pumping station that might break down any time, along with emergency equipment and staff to help if it did. Residents were advised to register for flood alerts from the Environment Agency. Unfortunately, this news came out just as Storm Chandra hit Britain with strong winds and heavy rain. The storm led King Charles to shut down the children's play area at Sandringham Estate because of unsafe conditions, showing the types of dangers Marsh Farm could encounter. Royal watchers noted with alarm that Andrew's flooding woes would have deepened as Storm Chandra struck, demonstrating in real time the weather events that could threaten his new home. The flood risk raised serious questions about the king's decision-making in selecting Marsh Farm. Had environmental risks been properly assessed? Was the king aware of the flooding vulnerability? And if he was aware, why place a family member in a property with such obvious risks when other properties on the Sandringham estate were available? Some royal commentators suggested the choice of Marsh Farm, despite its flood risks, might have been deliberate, part of a strategy to make Andrew's life uncomfortable enough that he might eventually choose to leave the United Kingdom entirely. But the flood warnings weren't the only shocking revelation about Marsh Farm's suitability. The security nightmare and emergency drone ban over Marsh Farm. As Andrew's move approached, another serious concern emerged. Security experts raised alarms about the property's vulnerability, and authorities took the extraordinary step of extending Sandringham's no-fly zone to include Marsh Farm, preventing drones from surveilling the property. The original no-fly zone around Sandringham House protected the royal family during Christmas gatherings. The need for such protections had been dramatically demonstrated in March 2025, when drones were spotted flying over Sandringham during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to King Charles. That incident raised serious concerns about the estate's security. The new legislation covering Marsh Farm was made on September 16, 2025, and came into force on September 22, weeks before Andrew's titles were formally stripped. This timing suggested that planning for Andrew's move had been underway for some time before the public announcement. The order stated that the Secretary of State has decided that it is necessary in the public interest to amend the restricted area. An explanatory note added that it has been agreed by the Civil Aviation Authority and the Department for Transport that flying should be restricted in the vicinity of the specified areas for reasons of public safety and security. Despite these enhancements, experts questioned whether Marsh Farm could ever be made as secure as Royal Lodge had been, with its established security infrastructure and position within protected Windsor Great Park. Marsh Farm sat 2 miles from Sandringham House on an isolated rural property, making rapid response to any security incident more difficult. Sources indicated that King Charles would be funding Andrew's future accommodation and security privately rather than through public money, representing a significant ongoing expense. Some observers questioned whether it might have been more cost-effective to allow Andrew to remain at Royal Lodge, where security was already established. But while security concerns were serious, they were just one element of the broader crisis surrounding Andrew's dramatic change in circumstances. Sarah Ferguson's separate plans and the splitting of the former couple. Throughout all the drama, one relationship had seemed stable: Andrew's close bond with ex-wife Sarah Ferguson. Sarah had stood by him through years of scandal, living at Royal Lodge since 2008 in what they described as a close friendship. But as the reality of leaving Royal Lodge set in, sources revealed that this relationship was about to change. Exclusive reports in January 2026 revealed that Sarah would not be accompanying Andrew to Marsh Farm and was instead ready to spread her wings. A source said, "Andrew and Sarah have to move out by the 25th of January, and she has stood by him all these years but is now ready to spread her wings. She won't be moving in with him to the new house on the Sandringham estate." Sarah was very upset and was seeking support from Beatrice and Eugenie. Losing her title as Duchess of York was hard for her. Sources said she would not be moving in with Beatrice in the Cotswolds, but was making her own plans in Windsor. The separation of Andrew and Sarah marked the end of their unique post-divorce relationship. They had managed to stay close since their divorce in 1996, which was impressive, and Sarah had shown great loyalty during the Epstein scandal. However, even her loyalty had its limits. For Andrew, losing Sarah's constant presence represented yet another significant blow. She had been his companion, his defender in public, and someone who understood the unique pressures of royal life. Without her at Marsh Farm, Andrew would be even more isolated. The timing of Sarah's decision raised questions about whether she knew something about Marsh Farm or Andrew's long-term prospects that made her unwilling to tie her fate to his any longer. But while Sarah was making plans to move on, revelations about Andrew's immediate future continued to emerge. The shoebox-sized reality and loss of all royal amenities. As more details emerged about Marsh Farm, the full extent of Andrew's fall from grace became impossible to ignore. Friends used the phrase "shoebox-sized house" repeatedly, and this wasn't hyperbole but rather an accurate reflection of the dramatic difference between his past and future homes. The loss of amenities was particularly stark. At Royal Lodge, Andrew had enjoyed a private swimming pool, an aviary, a beautiful sunken garden, and the Royal Chapel of All Saints for private worship. All of these would be gone at Marsh Farm. He would no longer be able to attend religious services in privacy, but would need to travel elsewhere, potentially exposing him to public view and media attention. The 6 lodge cottages that housed staff and guests at Royal Lodge had no equivalent at Marsh Farm, where the property was barely large enough for Andrew himself. The gardener's cottage and police accommodation that had been integrated into Royal Lodge's infrastructure would also be left behind. The loss of live-in staff was particularly significant for someone who had never managed his own household independently. Andrew had grown up in Buckingham Palace, with staff attending to every need. Now, instead of his own dedicated team, he would be dependent on ad hoc assistance from Sandringham staff coming and going according to a schedule determined by his brother. Sources indicated this arrangement hasn't gone down well with Andrew, who was accustomed to having help available whenever needed. The psychological impact of this shift from having his own household to being dependent on assistance at his brother's discretion should not be underestimated. The lack of suitable garaging for Andrew's luxury vehicles was another detail that spoke to the dramatic downgrade. While sources suggested this may be dealt with during the refurbishment, the reality was that the property simply wasn't designed for the lifestyle accessories Andrew had always taken for granted. Friends indicated that the reality of Marsh Farm had hit Andrew hard. The phrase, "he really didn't want Marsh Farm," captured his deep reluctance. But the formal eviction notice left him with no choice but to comply. Royal experts noted that the King's choice of Marsh Farm sent a clear message to the wider public and other royals. Titles and privileges came with expectations of behavior, and failing to meet those expectations would result in swift, severe, and permanent consequences. But while the loss of amenities was shocking, the implications of Andrew's isolation raised even more concerning questions. The isolation strategy and questions about Andrew's long-term future. Royal commentators increasingly concluded that the choice of Marsh Farm represented a deliberate strategy of isolation and control. By placing Andrew at a remote farmhouse 2 miles from Sandringham House, King Charles was signaling that Andrew's exile from royal life would be geographic as well as social and ceremonial. Richard Fitzwilliams articulated this view explicitly when he said that moving Andrew to Sandringham was one way of, in a sense, controlling him. The king wanted his disgraced brother where he could monitor him, but not so close that Andrew's presence would create awkward situations during family holidays. The deliberate nature of this isolation became apparent when reports emerged that Andrew had initially requested Wood Farm, Prince Philip's former retirement home. Wood Farm would have been more comfortable while still representing a major downgrade, but crucially, it was located much closer to Sandringham House. The request was denied specifically because Wood Farm was deemed too close to the rest of the royal family. This rejection revealed the king's thinking clearly. Andrew could be given accommodation on the Sandringham estate, but it needed to be far enough away that he wouldn't accidentally encounter other royals. The 2-mile distance was apparently the minimum acceptable buffer zone. The isolation strategy extended beyond physical distance. While Royal Lodge had been in Windsor, where Andrew had built connections over 2 decades, Marsh Farm was in a rural area, where Andrew had no established relationships. He would be starting over socially at age 65 or 66. The move to Norfolk also meant Andrew would be far from his daughters, who both maintained residences in or around London and had been important sources of support. The geographic separation was another form of isolation that would make life at Marsh Farm even more lonely. Friends indicated Andrew was well aware of the isolation strategy and might ultimately choose to leave the United Kingdom entirely. One friend said, he could relocate to the Middle East where he has long established business contacts. This possibility was taken seriously enough that royal experts discussed it as a realistic scenario. The Middle East option was particularly intriguing because Andrew had maintained relationships in countries like Dubai and the UAE. These connections potentially offered him the possibility of a life where his scandal might not follow him quite as relentlessly, and where he might maintain a more comfortable lifestyle than what awaited him at Marsh Farm. The question of Andrew's long-term future remained genuinely open. with multiple scenarios still possible. He might accept his exile to Norfolk. He might eventually be moved again if Marsh Farm proved unworkable, or he might choose to leave the United Kingdom entirely. What seemed increasingly clear was that Marsh Farm was unlikely to be Andrew's final destination, whether because environmental problems made it untenable, because the isolation proved too much, or because the broader strategy ultimately succeeded in pushing him out of the country entirely. But one final revelation about Marsh Farm cast everything in an even more shocking light. The ultimate warning: Marsh Farm as temporary housing and what it really means. In a stunning development in mid-January 2026, reports suggested that Marsh Farm might not even be Andrew's permanent residence, but rather temporary or interim accommodation, while something else was being arranged. This revelation raised profound questions about King Charles's true intentions. Sources indicated that Andrew would be offered temporary accommodation on the Sandringham estate while renovation work continued on Marsh Farm, or potentially on some other property. The precise location of this interim housing remained unclear. This meant Andrew's housing crisis was far from over, and he might face additional moves and uncertainties in the months ahead. The prospect of being shifted from one temporary property to another represented a new form of instability that must have been deeply unsettling. Some observers interpreted the temporary designation as evidence that King Charles had not yet made final decisions about how to handle his brother long-term. The extensive renovations at Marsh Farm seemed inconsistent with it being truly temporary, as the investment in security fencing, CCTV, and improvements wouldn't make sense for a brief occupancy. Another interpretation was that describing Marsh Farm as temporary was a face-saving measure that allowed Andrew to accept the move without completely giving up hope that his circumstances might improve. By framing the farmhouse as interim accommodation, the King's team could present it as a reasonable short-term solution rather than as Andrew's permanent fate. Sources suggested that Andrew was anticipated to complete his relocation prior to Easter, which added extra stress. There were also assertions that the provisional housing setup could result in him departing Windsor before he reached the age of 66 on February 19th. These timeframes indicated that King Charles was urging his brother to expedite the move rather than postponing it for several months. Royal experts noted that describing Andrew's housing as temporary left options open for future adjustments if circumstances changed. If Andrew's health deteriorated, if security threats increased, if flooding made Marsh Farm genuinely unlivable, or if public opinion shifted, the temporary designation meant that moving him again would be presented as part of the original plan, rather than as an admission that Marsh Farm had been a mistake. The ultimate warning that Marsh Farm represented was not just about flooding risks, inadequate garaging, or isolation, but rather about the fundamental uncertainty and instability that now defined Andrew's entire existence. He had gone from being a prince with a secure home and clear role to being someone whose housing was temporary, whose titles had been stripped, whose future was uncertain, and whose very presence in the United Kingdom might be negotiable. Marsh Farm symbolized not just a smaller house, but a fundamentally diminished and precarious status that could change again at any time. Which aspect of Andrew's eviction do you find most shocking? Do you think King Charles is handling the situation appropriately, or should the king have made different arrangements for his disgraced brother? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.